So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham lived at Beersheba. Sarah lived 127 years. This was the length of Sarah's life. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is, Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Abraham rose up from beside his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a stranger and an alien residing among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, so that I may bury my dead out of my sight. A year and a half ago, I did an episode on this podcast that told the story of the time when Abraham took his son Isaac, tied him up, laid him upon an altar, and held a knife to his throat. The incident is known in the tradition as the binding of Isaac, but I called my episode Isaac Unbound. Now, this story has been understood in both Christian and Jewish traditions in various ways, with various interpretations, packed with all kinds of theological meaning. But I chose to tell that story from the point of view of Isaac. And frankly, all I could see was how a child would have been completely traumatized by the actions of his father, who, perhaps from his point of view, was acting like a crazed religious fanatic. Ever since, as I've looked at Isaac's story after that, as I see his very flawed relationship with his sons, Jacob and Esau, and his off-again, on-again love story with his wife, I have not been able to stop myself from wondering whether these might not be the actions of a man who is living with unresolved trauma. Do all of the future troubles of Isaac go back to what went wrong on that mountain? And with all of that in mind, I've decided to take a good narrative look at the immediate aftermath of those events on Mount Moriah, because I have noticed something. After they come off of that mountain, there are no references to Isaac having anything to do with his father. I mean, think of it. After the story of the binding of Isaac, we are told that Sarah, Isaac's mother, dies, and Abraham buries her, and yet Isaac is not there to bury his own mother. He is not involved at all. And this is despite the fact that we are told later that Isaac needed to be comforted after his mother's death, and that he did not find that comfort until his new wife, Rebekah, was brought to him. Most significantly, Isaac does not get any comfort from his father. He apparently has no contact with him. But if you think that is strange, consider what else Abraham did without making contact with his son. He got him married. Now, I know it is true that in that world, marriages were arranged, and that the wishes of the couple themselves were generally not considered to be important. But Abraham never has so much as a conversation with Isaac throughout the entire process. And, most significantly, He is not even there for the wedding, the moment when Isaac takes his new wife into his mother's tent. And yes, you heard that right. It says that Isaac took her into his mother's tent, not his father's. In fact, if we go by the stories we are told, Isaac never has anything to do with Abraham again. Not until the old man dies, and he and his half-brother Ishmael bury him together in Sarah's tomb. That sounds like a grudge that lasts for decades, according to the chronology of Genesis. Family arguments are no fun. They are often devastating, full of cruelty and pettiness, but they are sometimes entertaining all the same. So, let's ask, what really happened after Abraham and Isaac came back from the mountain? This is Retelling the Bible. Episode 9.1, After Mount Moriah. When Abraham and Isaac returned to Beersheba from Moriah, Sarah was the first to greet them. She rushed out of her tent as soon as the servants cried out that they saw 4 men and a donkey approaching from the distance. She knew it had to be them. For some odd reason, she had been on edge ever since they had left. Her husband had told her little about where he was going or why, but what she saw in his face had concerned her. There was something that he wasn't telling her, and she knew that it couldn't be good. As she ran out to meet them now, her worst fears seemed to be confirmed. With a glance, she took in the scene. She looked at her son and saw that he was very much drawn into himself. The carefree and engaged son that had gone off with his father days ago seemed to be gone and was replaced by a young man who looked around fearfully at everything. Even more telling, however, was Abraham's strange behavior. He wouldn't even look at her. He turned away, yelling for servants to come and take care of their baggage. Sarah glared at the back of her husband. Oh yes, she would have words with him later. Sarah put Isaac to sleep in her tent. There were so many things she wanted to ask him. Clearly something had upset him on the journey, but he seemed so fragile that she didn't dare interrogate him. She was afraid that he would fall apart before her eyes. So she just soothed him and sang to him until he finally seemed to settle down to a fitful sleep. She told herself that they would have a proper talk later. But for now, she would have it out with Abraham in his tent. But Isaac wasn't asleep. He had wanted desperately to tell his mother everything that had happened, but he couldn't bring himself to say a word. He told himself that he would tell her everything later, and just slowed his breathing and closed his eyes and waited for her to leave. That was how Isaac came to hear everything that went on in his father's tent. He couldn't quite make out the individual words, but he hardly needed to understand what was happening. He heard his mother asking pointed questions, and the incredulity in her voice at Abraham's brief answers. He listened as their voices rose until each was trying to shout over the other. He had heard his parents argue before. Both of them were extremely strong-willed, but he had never heard anything quite like this before. And then, suddenly, Sarah just stopped, right in the middle of a string of oaths and expletives. There were a few moments of silence that seemed so out of place in the chaos of the night. And then Abraham started calling out his wife's name with a strange panic. Soon he was calling out the names of various household servants with urgency. And before long, the entire camp had erupted into utter chaos. Isaac remained in the tent, though. He was far too frightened to leave, something he would reproach himself over for years later. Eventually, he did drift off into a nightmare-filled sleep. When Isaac saw his mother the next morning, he almost didn't recognize her. It was as if one entire side of her face had fallen. Her eye and one side of her mouth drooped down in an alarming fashion. She tried to speak to him, but he couldn't make much sense out of any of the strange noises that came from her mouth. He also couldn't help but notice how her left arm lay dead and motionless at her side. Time passed, and she did get a bit stronger. She did learn as months and then years went by how to say a few words with great effort. Eventually, she even managed to move her left arm and leg somewhat, but there was no strength in her hand, and she could not walk alone. She would never again be the mother that Isaac had known. They never would be able to talk through the nightmare he had lived through on that mountain. Many said that she was in her condition because she had been struck by a god. That was the common understanding of such a thing. There really was no other explanation. It was suggested by some that Abraham's God, Yahweh, had struck her for arguing with her husband. But Isaac did not really blame Yahweh, not completely. As far as he was concerned, there was one person who was much more to blame. He did not think he would ever forgive his father for taking his mother from him. Sarah lingered for years. As soon as he could, Isaac took her and went to live with her in Hebron, while Abraham remained in the area of Beersheba. This was perfect as far as Isaac was concerned. He wouldn't have minded if he never saw his father again. Finally, in her 127th year, when Isaac was 37 years old, Sarah slipped away. He was with her until the end. He wept as he sat beside her all night long. Word had to be sent to Abraham, of course, but Isaac made sure that, long before he arrived, he took his mother's tent, packed up her belongings, and with only a few servants and some donkeys to accompany him, he set out for a place he had never seen, but that he had dreamt of for years. He set out for Beer Lahai Roy. Isaac had pretty much had it at that point with the God of his father. Abraham had insisted that everything he had done on that mountain had only been on the instructions of his God. That was enough to convince Isaac that such a God did not have his interests in mind. But his stepmother, Hagar, had told him of another God, a God who had been able to see her. Hagar and Sarah had never had an easy relationship. They had argued constantly, mostly over the status of their respective sons. But there had been a connection between Isaac and Hagar. When he was quite young, before he was completely weaned and Hagar was sent away, she had often been the one who told him stories before bed. And one of the stories she told him had remained with him. Before he was even born, Sarah and Hagar had fought. Her mistress had made things so terrible for Hagar that she had run away. She soon found herself in a deserted place with few resources, and began to fear that she would not be able to survive. That was when a God appeared to her. This divine being told her to return and to raise the son that she would bear to Abraham, and that he would found a great nation. Hagar was blown away at the very idea that a God could see her, much less make promises to her. Who was she? Nothing but a woman, a slave, and a concubine. And so, in wonder, she named the God she met in that place El Roy, the God who sees. And amazingly, that God graciously accepted the name that she gave. Hagar also named the place after her encounter. Beer Lahai Roy, she called it. The place would remain holy to her and to her son's descendants ever afterwards. Though he had been so young when he heard it, And though so much time had passed since then, Isaac never forgot that story. After all that he had gone through and all that he had lost, Isaac felt a deep need to be seen for who he was. And so, on the day after his mother died, he packed up his mother's tent and everything that had belonged to her and headed out to find Bir Lahai Roi and the God who lived there. I wanted to tell this story to try and work through some of the strangeness in the story in Genesis of the death of Sarah and the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah. There are too many things in those episodes that just don't make much sense. Why, when Sarah dies, is she living in Hebron, while Abraham, at least the last we heard of him, is living in Beersheba? Why is there no contact at all between father and son throughout the entire saga of the death, burial, and the wedding? Why has Isaac been in Bir Lahai Roi, the place where Hagar encountered God? There are just so many questions that it became a great puzzle for me. There are certainly some rabbinic teachers, links in the show notes, that have suggested that the whole Mount Moriah story may have created a rift between Abraham and Sarah, and have even contributed to Sarah's death. So I decided to run with that idea. But there was a chronological problem that created. Isaac doesn't seem to be much more than a boy when Abraham tries to sacrifice him on Mount Moriah. And yet, Sarah doesn't die until he's about 37 years old. So, how can the two stories be connected? Well, you have just heard my story of how I think the connection might have worked. What do you think? Is that the story that the author was hinting at? How would you solve the narrative puzzle that is the story of Abraham and Isaac after they came down from Mount Moriah? That is it for this episode of Retelling the Bible. Please subscribe so you can get the next regular episode in 2 weeks' time. The theme music for the podcast is Ada by Kevin MacLeod, and the mood music for this episode was Dreamsphere 7 by Sasha End. The music is licensed in the Creative Commons and can be found at incompetech.com and at ND app, respectively. You can contact me on Blue Sky at Retelling the Bible, and on the Facebook page Retelling the Bible. Show notes for this episode have been posted at retellingthebible.wordpress.com. Thanks to my Patreon supporters, and hi to new friend Jimmy. Go to patreon.com/retellingthebible to support this podcast. This is Retelling the Bible, and I have been your storyteller, W. Scott McCandless.